One of the fundamental building blocks that you're going to end up using in your JavaScript code is the variable. So in our applications, we have this problem that we need to solve where we're going to have different pieces of data kind of littered throughout our application. And so what we need to be able to do is reference that data in our code without it being confusing. And so in JavaScript, we have this concept of a variable. It's a way that we can give a name to something without having to worry about like, well, what is this thing? So for example, over here in this text editor, if I get rid of var equals order. So that's technically a piece of data in our application, an empty array, but we don't really know what it is. And so what variables allow us to do is to give that thing or that piece of data a name. So in this case, we have var order equals empty array. So we're giving this thing a name. So basically what variables are doing is they're allowing us to store different types of data. So in JavaScript, you'll hear this word from time to time of primitives. So primitives are different types of data, like a string. So let's do an example over here. So we're going to say we've got like a string, a number, an object. So we'll say tacos or tasty, and things like an array. So we got 1, 2, 3, and then Boolean. So you're true and you're false. So we have all these different types of data, and what those data actually represent is just going to depend on the application, but we need a way to reference them. And by themselves, they're not terribly useful. So if I said, if I put a variable in front of this, so we'll say foods equals. So immediately what I've done by creating a variable is I've added context to this data. I know that, oh, this object or this data, if we kind of zoom out a little bit and not worry too much about the primitive or the type, well, this object represents different foods. Now, foods with taste may be a little better of a name, but the idea is that we can give this data a name. And the name is technically arbitrary. It's whatever we want it to be. And so as you kind of develop as a programmer, you're going to learn that different naming techniques and things and conventions have different value to you. But in general, that's it. That's the basic foundation of what a variable is for. So over here on the right, I've got this var order equals an empty array. And so what we're doing here is we're creating our variable. So we're saying var, and this is known as a keyword. So the var keyword is saying, okay, JavaScript, let's declare a variable, and then we give that variable a name. So we're saying declare a variable called order, and then we're doing what's called an assignment. So we're saying this variable is equal to this empty array. And so now, if we come over here and we say something like console log order, we're going to see down here in the console, well, we get an empty array, which makes sense. And so we can do all sorts of things with this. So now we can modify this variable. So if we say, let's push an item in here. So we're going to say ID of 1 and name is Tangy Pickles. So I don't know about you, but I love pickles. So if we do that, and then we're going to bring back our console log. So we're going to say console log order. If I can type okay, let's see here. And there we go. So what happened is this code was executed. So we created our variable, which had an empty array. And then here what I'm doing is I'm using the push method. So whenever you define an array, behind the scenes, even though you don't see it, JavaScript has defined different methods based on the type of data that we have in our code. And one of the methods for an array is called push. So it's literally like if you imagine yourself kind of like pushing, we'll say a piece of paper into a box. That's what you're doing here. You're saying push the paper into, or push this object, in this case, into this box or this array. So we're saying push this chunk of code into here. And so that's why when we console log order, so we define it, modify it or add to it, and then we log its value, that's why down here in the console we see an array with one object in it, which is our Tangy Pickles food. Pretty cool. So the basic idea at play here is that what we're doing is we're, technically speaking, declaring and assigning a variable at the same time here. So what I mean by that is, and this really ultimately depends on the type of code that you're writing. So this isn't always something that you have to do, but it is good to know about and it is useful. So what we can technically do if we want, what I just did here is I declared a variable called order, but I didn't assign anything to it. So what I mean by that is now that variable exists in memory. So basically, JavaScript can see this, but there's no value to it. So if we console.log order here, let's see if we can clear it fast enough. There you go. So technically, it's undefined. There's nothing assigned to it. So whenever you have a variable with nothing assigned to it, you're going to get undefined as the response for the current value. So if you put that into a sentence, the current value is undefined, is a good way to think about it. So what we can do is we can do the assignment on a separate line. So we'll just say, okay, go ahead and assign order up here to this empty array. And then we'll notice when we console log it, we get our empty array instead of undefined, which is pretty cool. So where things get interesting with all this stuff is with the whole conversation between let and const and var. So if you're just starting to learn JavaScript, it's likely that if you've read a tutorial, you might have seen something like let, we'll just say pizza. We'll say yummy. So we'll say let pizza yummy, or you might see const, turkey equals gobble. So you might see stuff like this. I don't know what applications are going to say pizza yummy, turkey gobble, but follow along. So you may have seen this part of the code. You might see this usage of let and const, maybe in addition to var. And I say maybe because var is starting to fall out of favor in favor of something like let. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but you may see these things. And what's going on here is that in 2015, the standards board that's responsible for defining the standard for JavaScript, the language, came out with a new version, and in that new version, they added let and const as ways or methods for defining different variables in JavaScript. So what I want to do for the rest of this video is kind of walk you through different examples of how these different types of variables work, but also explain when you would actually want to use one over the other. So what we're going to do is we're going to back this up. We're going to take a look at this example here. So if you're more of a reader type, you can also go over to cleverbeagle.com/blog and check out this post in person. So if you ever want to review this or kind of copy and paste this code, you can kind of do both. So not only does this act as a nice script for me, but it also gives you a way to very easily kind of go in here and pull out these examples. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through this example. So we have var order, and then we're defining a function called add to order, which takes in an item as an argument. And then what it's going to do is it's going to take that item and it's going to push it, just like we saw before, into the order array. But it's only going to do that when we call the add to order function. So what we're going to do is call it. We're going to say, okay, let's add ID of 1, and then we have some absolutely delicious tarantula nuggets. Yum, 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 yum. And then we're going to say console log order. So what we get is, well, let's think through this. So we've defined our variable order, and we've assigned it. So we've declared it, and we've assigned it at the exact same time. And more often than not, this is how you're going to declare your variables. You're not going to do the declaration and the assignment independently of each other. Sometimes you will, but more often than not, it's going to look like this. And so we've declared and assigned our order variable, and then we've defined a function called add to order where we take in the item, and then we say, okay, when we get that item in, we're going to push it into this array. And so we're calling this function add to order, and we're passing it this object. And notice that this object maps to item here inside of the function. So even though it may not look like it, what we're technically doing is we're saying take this, pass it to here, and then push it into our array at the name order, at the variable order. And so that's why when we get down to console.log order and we see it in the console, well, we get an object, or we get an array with one object in it, which is our tasty, tasty tarantula nuggets. So pretty interesting stuff here. Basically what we want to keep in mind is that there's some mischief at play here, because this may look a little weird. If you've never seen code like this before, you may be saying like, well, wait a minute. We've defined order up here, but we're referencing order inside of this function. So how does all this work? How does it actually know that that's okay? And the reason why this is okay is something called scope. So in JavaScript, you have this concept of scope. And the best way I found to visualize it is think about like a series of boxes within boxes. And certain boxes have a scope of all the other boxes inside of them. Whereas if you define something inside of one of those boxes, well, it can't escape that box. And so let's kind of walk through this. So in this instance, or in this example, right now, order is what's known as being in the global scope of this file. So this entire chunk of code that we have here, we'll reference this as a JavaScript file. And so what's going on here is because we've declared order at the top of our file and it's not nested inside of anything else, it's technically globally available to all of the other code in this file. And so that means it has a global scope. Now, what we can do is say, all right, well, let's go ahead and change this up a little bit. So we've got var order now. I'm going to modify order from within here. So we're going to say order equals ID1, and then we'll call this very vanilla ice cream. And let's go ahead and clear this. There we go. So what we're doing here is we're saying, well, technically order is in the global scope, so we're able to modify it right here. So this is where scope can get kind of confusing. So if we look at this very carefully, we're defining this up here, which means, and if you kind of visualize like a box around all this code, because that order is inside of the box that this add to order function is also within, this function can see the order variable. There's no difference between this. So this doesn't act like a boundary or anything. You can just kind of walk right through it and see the order value. So that's why we're able to modify it and we're able to reference it down below as well. So basically all of these things are within scope. Now, what you may have noticed, and this is kind of a little bit of foreshadowing when we start to talk about let and const later, you'll notice that I was able to directly reassign this order variable. So what I mean by reassign is notice that I'm not saying var order here again. I'm just saying, okay, give me this order variable and set it equal to or assign it to this value. And so we call this reassignment because what's happening here is we've already defined and assigned a default value to order up here. But right here, we're saying, well, order already exists, but go ahead and overwrite it with this. And so then we're saying, okay, reassign it and then push in our new item. So that's why down below, what we're seeing is we've got two objects in our array now, one with very vanilla ice cream and one representing the tarantula nuggets. So that's the basic idea at play here is we're saying, well, this var order is in scope, so we can reference it throughout the rest of our code. So where this gets interesting is when we start to talk about function scope. So function scope is when we're dealing with literally the scope or the box. So if you think about this is the top of the box, this is the bottom of the box, and like together this is creating like a little boundary around our code. So what we can do if we take this and we're gonna get rid of this line and we're gonna say, okay, let's go ahead and var order. So what we should get, let's see if this console actually let us do it. I don't know if it will. Let's see, save it. May not actually show us here. So let's see if they're in the main browser console here. There we go. So what we notice is that we're getting an uncaught reference error. So this is saying order is not defined. So that's this line barking at us. It's saying, hey, wait a minute. Order is not defined. What is that? And the reason it can't see it here is because notice we've moved our declaration and assignment of the order variable inside of this function. And so now var order is only visible within the function scope. So we've got this as our function scope. Well, now because we declared our variable in here, no other code outside of this function can see order. So basically this is acting like a wall to the outside world. It's saying, sorry, this is only a variable for here. So this is known as function scope. So this is really useful if you only want to define a value inside of a function, but you don't want to do anything else with it. So a good example of this might be maybe I return the order after I modify it. So I say, okay, for whatever reason, we're not adding to a global order. We're just going to add to this one order that we're creating in memory. And so now if I say, let's see here. So we're going to say var my order equals. So because we're calling our function, we expect it to return us a value. We're going to store the return value in this var myOrder. So if we change this to myOrder now, we should get what we'd expect. So we get an array back now with our tarantula nuggets in it. And so that's only because we said, okay, call the function. That function takes in our item, creates the order array, pushes in the item into that order array, and then returns it. And so the end result is that because this code is assigned to a variable, this function call is assigned to a variable, the response or the return value is now assigned back to this myOrder variable. And so that's why we can get away with this. So that's function scope. The basic idea at play is, well, now because we've defined our variable inside of a function, well, the outside world can't see it. And that has all sorts of implications depending on the type of code that you're writing and why you're writing it, but it's very important to understand that. So if you're ever confused about like, well, wait a minute, I just defined this variable, why can't my code down here see it? Generally speaking, that's going to be a problem with scope. So you got to pay attention to that. So what we're going to do now is talk about lets. So this is where a lot of programmers can get confused, or people that are new to JavaScript can get confused, because a lot of this stuff looks the same. So it seems to behave the same. So what I want to do is back this code up a little bit. So we're just going to say, let's define our order up here. We've got our add to order call still, but we're going to get rid of that. And then we're just going to log order again. So now let's make sure. Okay, so we get our tarantula nuggets. But now what I want to do is I'm going to change this. So now we're going to use let instead of var. And so what we'll notice is that, well, nothing really changes. So this is the confusing part, because you may say like, well, wait, are these the same thing? Why aren't they changing anything, or what's going on here? So what we're going to do is we're going to say, well, let's take this and move it inside now. So we're going to do exactly what we did with var. And so if we look, again, we got to open up our inspector here and go to this console tab. We can see, okay, same exact thing as var. We have our function scope, and the variable is kind of trapped in here. So on the surface, you may say like, well, wait a minute, these are identical. And they're kind of identical, but there's one little difference. So let's kind of keep this down here in case we need it again. Actually, you know what? We're going to close it so we got enough space, because I'm getting all... Uh-oh, we broke CodePen. Let's give it a refresh here. There we go. Yeah, it's a little better. I don't know why I can't see the console anymore here. There it is. That's what we want. Okay, so we've got this basic example with let, and we're doing all that stuff. But now what I want to do is show you why let is special. So we talked about the function scope, but one of the differences between var and let is that let has something called block scope. So what we're going to do is we're going to define our order with our let variable, or our let keyword here. So we're going to say let order. And then what I want to show you is changing based on block scope. So we're going to say, as an example, say if order.length is equal to 0, we're going to define a little warning. So we're going to say empty order error equals, I'll say your order is empty, add some items. So right now what we've done is we've defined a new variable. So we're going to say let empty order error, and we're only going to define that variable if the order length is equal to 0. So what we're going to do is say, well, we want to log that message if it exists. So we're going to say console log empty order error. And so this is where scope starts to come into play. So we're going to pull up in our console again. And what we're going to see is that empty order error is not defined. Now, what's interesting about this is that we've got let order here, and then we're saying inside of this if block, let empty order error equal this, and then try and log it. But you'll notice that the code can't see it, so it's not defined. And the reason why is that let is block scoped, meaning just like we saw with functions, this block, so, and this name is kind of arbitrary. This isn't necessarily the official name for this, but that's what you'll hear a lot of developers reference it as. So this block of code is now encapsulating or blocking off this variable from the rest of the other code. So because I wrapped an if statement around it, now we can't get access to this variable outside of anything. Now, you may say like, well, wait a minute. So what happens with the var? So let's go ahead and change it up. So we're going to say var order and then var empty order air. Well, notice, well, wouldn't you know, we get access to the variable now. And everything seems to work. So this is the key difference between var and let. You get into this situation where basically var doesn't have the concept of block scope. It only has the concept of function scope. So if we define a variable inside of a function, it's scoped only to that function. But if we put it inside of a block, so like here we're saying inside of an if statement, then it doesn't have any scope there. That is technically defined, as far as JavaScript is concerned, out in the open for everybody else to get access to it. So that's why this code executes as expected. So the basic rule of thumb here, the basic idea at play, is that in most cases you're just going to want to use let. And the reason why is that this block scoping may look like an annoyance or it may look like a problem, but it's actually great. And the reason why is that as you write more and more complicated programs, so this example is very, very simple, but as you write your own programs that are more complex, you'll find that scoping is kind of a headache. So it would be really obnoxious if this code actually worked, because as far as the way that we've written it, if we look at it, it's like, well, we wouldn't expect empty order error to be accessible out here. Just in the sense of visual kind of information, we look at this and we're like, well, wait a minute. No, that's defined in here, so that's only for this block. And so let allows us to achieve that organically by itself, whereas var doesn't. And so that's the basic idea at play. And the rule of thumb that you'll hear a lot of developers say, and I agree with this fully, is just default to let. So typically nowadays, you're not really going to want to use var at all. The only time that you'll really come across it is if you're working with maybe it's like a package that you downloaded that's a little bit older and hasn't been updated in a while, or you're reading an older tutorial online. When you see var in those cases, unless it's going to affect the way that the code works, it's best to just kind of mentally say, okay, let me convert that to let. And then when you're writing your own code, convert it to let as well. So that's going to avoid any weird scoping problems or values getting overwritten and things like that, which, again, as you write more and more complex code, that's going to get really annoying. So there's one more example here that I want to show you in respect to these three big ones. We've got var, let, and const. So what I want to do now is show you how const behaves. So what we're going to do is get rid of all this noise here, and we're going to change this to const order equals, and then we're going to let all of this run. So let's save this. I'm going to give it a refresh here. And so what we'll notice is that just like let, just like var, when we define our variable with a const up here, so this is out in the global scope of the file again, this works as expected. So we get our variable, assign it to an empty array, have our function do the order.push work for us so that we add our item to the array, and then we log our order, and wouldn't you know, we have our tasty, tasty tarantula nuggets in there. So all looks fine up until this point. Now, where this gets interesting is in modification of this variable. So let's go ahead right here, and we're going to say order equals, and we're going to add back in our ice cream. So we're going to say ID1 name very vanilla ice cream. So we're going to save that. And now, if we look in our console again, so we get this error, uncaught type error assignment to constant variable. So what's interesting here is that constants, like the name implies, are constant. They cannot be changed. Or a better way to think about that is they cannot be reassigned. So you'll hear this term assignment or reassignment. So earlier we talked about declaring a variable and assigning it. Well, once we've done that using the keyword const, we cannot do that again as far as that variable is concerned. So here we're trying to say, well, we want to reassign order to this new array. Can't do it. So we're not allowed because basically const is creating a lock on that variable. It's saying, nope, it's already assigned a value, so you have to work with that value. Now, what's weird about that is we'll notice, so let's go ahead and comment that line out. So when we do that, we'll notice that the code works fine. So let's give it a refresh. Make sure this is clear. There we go. So this code evaluates just fine. So the difference between this line and this line, even though they may look the same, the idea is that here we're actually trying to overwrite the value of order, whereas here we're modifying the value that that variable contains. And so one way to think about that is that we're not technically changing this, we're changing this. Even though it may look like we're trying to modify order, we're not. We're saying, okay, whatever order contains, we want to call the push method on that and then add an item to it. So we're updating that. So the purpose of this is you'll run into instances in your code where you're not going to want a value to be reassignable. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, but this is the way around it. So you're going to pop the const in front of it, and that's going to make sure that it's frozen. Now, what's also interesting about this is that const, in terms of its scoping, works just like let. So if I take const order here and instead move it into our function, so we can still achieve the same thing. We can still push into the array, but now if we look in our console again, we're going to get order is not defined, so we can't see it. Again, we have function scope here, and then let's look at block scope just to make sure this is clear. So let's back this up, and we'll say, we'll just say if true here, just to create a block so we can see this at play. So we're going to say if true const order equals, and we get order is not defined. So const, just like let, is block scoping this variable to inside of this if statement. So again, the whole point here is that you're going to run into situations where that is highly valuable. So again, you're going to want to default to let, so you're going to want your values to be easily reassignable. Actually, I take that back. I'm going to flip that because it does, in a lot of cases, make sense to just use const. So start with const, and then if a value needs to be reassigned, then use let. And then var is saved for very rare cases, if ever, and then that'll keep you out of trouble. So that's the basic idea at play here, is that the different variable types are giving our variables different attributes or behaviors. So const order is saying, okay, I'm block scope, but you also can't change me once I'm defined. Let is saying, well, you can change me, you can reassign me, but if I'm in a block, you're not going to see me. It's only scoped to that, or if I'm in a function, I'm going to be scoped to there as well. So we've got those basic pieces. Now, there's one last thing I want to show you, and this is the idea of global variables. So, and this is, I have to stress, because this is going to look like, oh, well, duh, why wouldn't we use this? This is something you got to be absolutely, extremely, super duper careful with, and you never really want to use them unless you absolutely have to. So you'll notice that if I do this, I'm not putting a keyword in front of my variable name. So I've got my variable name order here, but I'm not using var, I'm not using let, and I'm not using const. I'm just going to do like that. So I'm just going to do order by itself. So we're going to say, all right, console log order. And we'll notice that we get an empty array, just like we'd expect. There's a slight difference here. So earlier when we talked about global scope, I kept saying global scope within this file. So what's happening now is that order is technically defined in the entire context of the running JavaScript. So if I open up my console here, let's clear this out. So I'm going to see if I can get away with this. I don't know if... No, okay. So CodePen in this case blocks us out. But technically, if we were in a regular JavaScript program, order is now, as soon as this file is loaded into memory, order is being defined inside of our entire application. So it's in the global scope, literally of all files, all code being currently executed, order is being defined as an empty array. Whereas if I said, oh, well, const order, we're basically making it so that order is defined only within the current file globally because it's at the top and everything else can see it. And so what you're going to find is that this looks very convenient, but it can get you into trouble. So let's look at an example here. So I'm going to create a oxymoron in code. So I'm going to put the string empty in an array. So technically it is not empty, but we're going to say empty string. And then we're going to say, okay, let's create our add to order function again. So we're going to take in our item. And we're going to say, let's do a reassignment. Or we're going to try and overwrite const order. Or, excuse me, we're going to try and overwrite our global variable order. And so we're going to say order equals the empty array. And then we're going to say order.push item. And then we're going to say add to order. We'll bring back the tarantula nuggets one more time, just because those sound oh so delicious. And then we're going to log order. Now, what you'll notice, let's do another save and refresh here. And this is where this gets very strange. So because order is defined globally, so again, this is not just global to the file, but global everywhere, because we've omitted the variable keyword or the let keyword or the const keyword. So this is now defined globally inside of the entire application. We've set that value to this array with an empty string inside of it. And even though right here we're trying to say, oh, well, let's overwrite order. So let me change it back to this. Okay, so what's the difference there? What just changed? So this is, again, the scoping problem. So because order up here is defined, even though we said define order in here again, and then push the item into it and log it, again, we have this problem of scope. And so what we run into is that this value up here is superseding whatever we do here until we go back and we do this. So now we change it and we get back what we'd expect. So what's weird about this, or why this is a problem, is that anywhere in our code that we want to use the variable name order, it now has to consider this global value of order. And so you run into this situation where basically I could have order defined in another file, set to one value, and then I might modify it in this code. And so now what I've done is I've technically modified that original copy. So if other code is dependent on order in another file globally, and then this file modifies it, and both of those files are executed at the same time or inside of the same instance, we'll say of JavaScript, or inside of the same page in a browser is the easiest way to think about it, we're going to be fighting with each other because now we're modifying that global copy of order versus a locally scoped to the file. So again, if I pop a const in front of this, try and do this, this is currently throwing an error. So if we open up the inspect here, I can't reassign a const again, so that's good. That's what we'd expect. But this is scoping it to the file, so we don't get into this situation where, oh, okay, now I have to worry about my variables fighting with each other. So that's basically it. That is the basic idea at play here. And you'll notice that as soon as I remove that assignment, we still have our array up here, but now because this is scoped to the file, we're pushing into it and we get the end result of empty plus the tasty tarantula nuggets right here. And then when we console log it, that's what we're seeing down here. So that's the basics of variables, and that's how variables work in JavaScript. They're very simple. So I don't want you to think like, oh man, this is complicated. They're actually quite simple in terms of what they're doing. The only thing you have to keep in mind are all these different rules around scope, and then in terms of the attributes or the behavior of the different types of variables. So again, the only one that really has any unique attributes is const, in that it won't let you reassign it. But other than that, they're basically all the same, save for those differences we saw with block scope versus function scope and global scope when we put something at the top of the file. So hopefully that made sense, and hopefully that was helpful. Again, this is one of the main building blocks that you're going to have in your code, so it's really important that you understand this. So if any of that confused you or some of the examples didn't make sense, please leave a comment down below. I really want to kind of help you to understand this, because once you get this, a lot of the other stuff gets pretty easy in JavaScript. So that's going to do it for this episode of Feature Fundamentals. Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, make sure to hit subscribe and then click the bell right next to the subscribe button to get notifications as soon as these are released, because we're going to be doing these pretty much indefinitely into the future here, because I want to walk you through all of the fundamentals of JavaScript so that you can be really productive with it and build some really cool stuff with it. So again, thanks for watching, and we will see you for the next episode.